Alright, so not clickbait. I actually did place my pre-order for the Sony a7 IV the day it was announced, and since I've actually placed a pre-order on it, and am going to be at some point a Sony a7 IV owner, I figured I would talk about this camera a bit. Now, with respect to actually pre-ordering an a7 IV and wanting to get this camera, I think it's worth considering maybe my own personal history with Sony cameras and what kind of led me to this. And this is going to cover a few different areas. So first things first, I started shooting video professionally in 2019, and I did this with the Sony a6500. This was a camera that was actually pretty much the first professional camera I ever used, which got to use someone else's second shooting a wedding, which is a story unto itself, as this was my first videography gig, and perhaps I'll tell that in a different video on this channel. But I did end up getting the a6500 not too long after that, and that would become sort of my first entrance into working with any sort of professional camera. Now fast forward not too long after that, and as I got more comfortable with the a6500, I also got more familiar with some of its limitations, among them being the aps-c crop sensor and wanting to sort of get into full frame and just sort of have a better experience in general, whether in terms of shooting ergonomics with the body or having maybe a viewfinder I could occasionally use and rely on rather than the tiny one that comes with Sony's 6000 series cameras. And so I ended up picking up this camera, well, behind me. That is the Sony a7 III, and that served really as my mainstay camera throughout, I'd say, much of 2020 and even a portion into 2021. Now the a7 III is an excellent all-around camera. Of course, I did mention the fact that I am a video-focused shooter. That is the vast majority of what I do, and so much as I got more into doing more things with video, the limitations of sort of the classic Sony bodies and the typical 4K 30, 8-bit 420 limitations with those cameras like the a7 III itself became a bit apparent. Now, Sony released in the summer of 2020 the a7S III, and of course, not surprisingly, I would end up having my eye on that, though it took me a little bit to actually pull the trigger on it, and so it was March of this year that I got the a7S III, and that has become certainly my A camera ever since. The summary is that camera has been nearly everything I expected and hoped it would be, and I don't really have too much of a reason at this point to try to move sort of beyond that camera, say maybe into a cinema body like the FX6. It's not something I see myself in the next year or so needing with the type of work that I do or that I expect to be doing. Now, with regard to that, you might then be asking, well, what type of work do you do? So on one level, I am both a second shooter and lead shooter in terms of video with another company that I work with. Shout out to TME. So with that, this covers a lot of different areas, right? Weddings, baptisms, engagements, small commercials for a lot of different types of work, modeling and portrait shoots, and the list goes on from there. Now separately, especially this year, I've also been starting to sort of build out my own business and getting gigs on that front. So on my own this year, I've been pursuing a lot of other similar but also different types of gigs, whether that covers corporate video work, concerts, and filming different events like that, even dabbling a bit in real estate. And so this also kind of spans a wide variety of things. However, all in all, a lot of this focuses back still on the video front. If we're trying to find some sort of ratio there between what type of shooter I am, I would say I'm a video shooter somewhere in like the 90 to 10 realm, where 90% of what I do is video, 10% is photo. Hence why I own an a7S III, and hence maybe the focus, or why I tend to focus more on video specs with these cameras. So with respect to the a7 III, how will getting the a7 IV change what I do with that camera? Now, both on the photo and video front, the a7 IV is really sort of a large jump from the a7 III in many ways, right? You're comparing a 24 megapixel sensor in the a7 III to a 33 megapixel sensor in the a7 IV. You're comparing sort of Sony's autofocus system and what it offered in 2018 versus now, 2021, 2022, and all of the different improvements there, such as animal, bird, eye autofocus now to add to human eye autofocus, as well as the touch tracking feature, which I've been making great use of in the a7S III. And of course, on the video spec front, this camera is going to differ considerably with what the a7 III offered versus what the a7 IV now contains. 10-bit 422, all of the new different Sony codecs like XAVC-SI and XAVC-HS, allowing 4K 60, albeit with a slight crop, s-cinetone, of course the flippy screen. So really, in many cases, this is going to be a massive upgrade video-wise over what the a7 III has, and so not surprising that necessarily the a7 IV would get the nod there and becoming my B cam. But if I'm also an a7S III owner, how does the a7 IV kind of slot in my lineup with respect to the a7S III? So as I mentioned previously, I did a review on the a7S III, and I think when it came to evaluating whether the a7 IV would be something I would consider purchasing, it was going to be based on whether the a7 IV could tick many of the boxes, much like the a7S III ended up doing for me. Now, does this camera shoot 4K and 120 frames per second? No. Does this camera shoot 4K 60 frames per second? Yes, albeit with an aps-c crop. Relatedly, this camera also will have aps-c crop mode back in 4K, perhaps that's a plus. Does this camera offer active stabilization, just like the a7S III and the FX3? Yes, that's helpful with doing handheld work, certainly. Does this camera, of course being the a7 IV, offer the same type of rolling shutter performance that would also be potentially helpful and useful in handheld? No, but it is at least supposedly on par with what the a7 III offered, which might be serviceable in a lot of cases. Is the low light performance going to be as good as the a7S III? No. But this camera also supposedly does have a dual ISO circuit that should, at least to some extent, offer some benefit in terms of low light compared to maybe some other cameras. Now, of course, I talked about many of the other features like 10-bit 422, s-cinetone, the codecs. Of course, ergonomically, this camera is very similar to an a7S III as well, so many of those improvements would be able to translate over to the a7 IV. In many cases, at least in terms of the video front, this camera seemed to be, well, sort of a baby a7S III, or FX3, except also having a 33 megapixel sensor and some of Sony's newest and better autofocus improvements that the A1 has, and so there seemed to be still a lot of benefit in picking this camera up. Sony's also apparently developed some new innovations that the a7 IV will have, which I think we can only hope they are able to roll out to some of their other cameras like the a7S III as well. This includes breathing compensation, at least for a number of their G Master and G series lenses, which you may have seen my review on the 20mm f1.8 G lens recently that I put out on this channel. And yes, one of the few, if any, drawbacks of this was focus breathing. So being able to correct this in camera and account for it there and make it essentially a non-factor in shooting is a pretty nice improvement. There's also the new focus map feature, which I'll say looks intriguing. I think the jury is still out on whether this is something that's a complete improvement over, say, focus peaking or other sorts of manual focus techniques and tricks, which I also do have a video on this channel, which I'd encourage you to check out if you're curious on how to do manual focus with Sony cameras. But nice to see them innovating and improving. Of course, some other differences with the body too, like the ability to now set the exposure compensation dial to many different things and having it being unlabeled from the get-go. And I think the soft skin filter also made a return, which hasn't been in this level of body since I think the A7R2. Can't say I'm probably going to use that, but that's interesting they brought it back. So yes, there are and should be some improvements with the a7 IV, even with respect to the a7S III. And so whether considering this camera from an owner of the a7 III perspective or the a7S III perspective, there's benefits to be had in picking this up and making it a part of my camera kit. Now that would mean I would have 3 camera bodies, and that's kind of where I want to be at this point. It's extremely difficult doing any gigs with 1 camera. That's something I learned very quickly. And 2 is definitely a good sweet spot and number, but I found with certain gigs, there are cases where it really helps to have 3 different camera angles, and so having 3 good bodies that could help in this regard would be definitely of use. I suspect I'm far from the only person that's planning on getting an a7 IV to become a B cam to the a7S III or FX3, specifically on the video front, given that it meets 80 to 90% of the things I use the a7S III for and the features that it has today. That said, I'm probably going to be testing out the a7 IV maybe as an A cam in a couple of different situations just to see how it fares over the coming year, and I'm definitely excited to see overall how this camera is going to pair with the a7S III, but just an overall in terms of being a great third companion to the a7S III and the a7 III that I own today. So in summary, yes, the a7 IV will probably become my #1 camera for doing anything photo related, which is still a small portion of the work that I do, and will probably become my main secondary or B cam for nearly all of the video work that I do, which takes up much of my time, and in many cases is mostly what I do. I'd be curious to others that are out there that are either considering the a7 IV or have made the plunge into pre-ordering it, kind of where you sit currently in terms of your thoughts for the a7 IV in your lineup of cameras. Is it your only camera? Are you adding it to sort of another assortment of Sony cameras? Maybe are you switching systems and this is going to be your first Sony camera out there? Nevertheless, I think that wraps up sort of my random assortment of thoughts on the a7 IV. Feel free to like this video, and I would say you could certainly expect a fair amount of Sony a7 IV content to be coming to this channel eventually at some point whenever I receive that camera, so please subscribe if that is of interest to you as well. For now, that is all I have to say. So thanks for watching.